now I'm going to demonstrate how to make a lot of healthy baking substitutions using banana bread so that you have a counterpoint to the regular banana bread we made earlier. But you can really use these in many types of baking. I would recommend that you don't make all of these substitutions that I'm going to make, but maybe pick one or two. Then you're going to end up with a product that looks and taste almost identical to the original version. If you do all of these adjustments that I'm going to make, it will taste a little bit different, but even adding all of these adjustments, it will actually still be quite good. It will not taste like a diet dessert or a diet quick bread. If you go beyond the amount that I'm substituting for any of the ingredients, to just inch it a little bit healthier, that's when the flavor and the texture really start to fall off and it becomes something that really tastes like, a health food and not necessarily like a dessert. So the first thing that we need to do, because it needs to sit for a little bit, is to make what we call flax eggs. So if you're going to substitute flax seeds for eggs, you get rid of all of the cholesterol in the recipe, making this a cholesterol-free recipe. And you get a lot of fiber, omega-3 healthy fats. There's just a lot of benefits to substituting these flax seeds for eggs. So in the original recipe, there were 2 eggs, so we're going to make the equivalent in flax eggs. So what you would do is for each 1 egg you want to replace, you have 1 tablespoon of flax and 2 tablespoons of water. If you're in a measuring cup, you can actually just put the water up to 1.5 ounces, which is the same volume as you would have for like a wet, cracked large egg. Since we're replacing 2, then we'll just go up to about 3 ounces and stir this. I have some preheated water. It could be, just very warm, hot. It doesn't have to be boiling hot. Okay, I think I'm pretty close. I'm just going to take my spoon and stir this around. You want to stir it right away. The flaxseed will start to get, thick and gummy pretty quickly. So that's only about 2 ounces, so I'll add a little bit more. And so what you're doing when you replace the flax is that you're really doing a couple of things, but not everything that an egg does in a recipe. So you're getting the binding, the fat, the moistness that you would get with an egg, but you're not getting leavening or rising. So the other adjustment that we're going to make to the recipe is add just another 1/4 teaspoon of baking powder beyond what you would have had in the original recipe, and that will add that rising component as well. We'll just let this sit for a few minutes while we do the other components of our recipe, and it will be ready to go. So there's not a lot of pre-planning that needs to happen with this. One other note about the flaxseed is that it's best to buy it whole and then blend it up in a coffee grinder or blender. You can buy it ground if you don't have a way to grind it at home, but it does tend to go bad more quickly once it's ground. If you have it ground, you need to keep it in the fridge or the freezer. If it's whole, you can keep it on the shelf because it's more shelf stable. And then if you haven't already watched the recipe on how to make the regular banana bread, I'd encourage you to do that. I go through a lot of important baking tips in there to make light, fluffy, decadent, quick breads. I won't repeat that here. But one thing that we'll do is we will mash up our bananas. I'm using very ripe bananas. They're brown but not super mushy. You can use them when they're much more brown than what I'm using here, but I think this is really the perfect point for making banana bread. If they're underripe, you just have to add a little bit, maybe another tablespoon of sugar to balance out the lack of sweetness you would have from not having as ripe a fruit. Okay. If you don't like touching it, you can use a masher or a whisk. I'm just going to smash this up with my hands because it's much quicker. Perhaps one of the least appealing sounds. You can also blend this up in a blender. So it's mostly like a puree now. There are a few little chunks in there which are okay. So we'll set our bananas off to the side, and then we're going to mix together all of our dry ingredients. And this is where the next substitution comes into play. So what I have here are some whole wheat pastry flour and some white all-purpose flour. If you recall from the other recipe, we had 2 cups of all-purpose flour, and now we'll use half of that in all-purpose flour, so 1 cup, and then half as whole wheat pastry flour. So there are a few varieties of whole wheat flour that you can get at the store. The most common one is it'll just say whole wheat flour. That's a little bit grainier, it has a stronger flavor if you're baking, and you can find the whole wheat pastry flour. It's a lot more subtle. If you're doing half and half with all-purpose flour, most people aren't even going to notice. I mean, honestly, if you don't tell them, they will not know that there's whole wheat flour in there. If you use the true whole wheat flour, the kind that doesn't have any pastry specification, you may taste it a little bit, but it will still be subtle if it's half and half. Once you go beyond half for the whole wheat flour, then it'll be a lot more distinct. And then the other change that I made is that this isn't a full cup of whole wheat pastry flour. It's actually 1 cup minus 1 tablespoon. So if you want to replace 1 cup of all-purpose flour in a recipe, you have the same measurement minus 1 tablespoon of the whole wheat flour. If you use equal parts, it will be drier and denser than the original was. And then again, it's not, 100% necessary to sift, but I like to sift my ingredients together. You can also just whisk them together. And then other things, I'll add my other dry ingredients. So I have some baking soda. And then I mentioned we're using just a little bit extra, an extra 1/4 teaspoon compared to the original recipe of baking powder to give it a little lightness since we don't have the egg. And I have cinnamon. And then I also reduced the salt by 25%. So in quick breads, muffins, cakes, any sort of bread, carbohydrate sort of food, it really will be super bland and tasteless and just not be an enjoyable eating experience if you completely have it salt-free. So I'd say, you can get away with 1/2 teaspoon to 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt, whereas it might have 2 or 3 times that in the original recipe in a lot of quick breads or muffins. But once you go below that, then you're not going to have a very tasty product. So we'll use a little bit of salt. And it's not like cooking where there's a lot of, you could add lots of herbs, you could add, some acid, you could add some other things to adjust. Baking is a lot more of a science, I should say. So unless you're a really experienced baker or pastry chef, I would recommend, substitutions you're not familiar with not trying because you're quite likely to end up with something that's not going to be very enjoyable at the end. Cooking is a lot more free form. There's a lot more experimentation you could do without being an expert at it. All right, so I just tap that, have everything nice and mixed together. So it doesn't really require more mixing, but again, if you didn't do that, you could just whisk everything. We'll set our dry ingredients off to the side. We'll go back to our bananas and we'll add the rest of the wet ingredients to this. So we have some sugar. So we're also reducing the sugar by about 25%. Once you reduce below that, then it again has a different texture, it has a different flavor, but you can reduce this by 25% and really no one's going to notice much of a difference unless they were maybe side by side. So I kept the white sugar the same and reduced the brown sugar by 1/2. So we had 1/2 cup of white sugar before and 1/2 cup of brown. Now we just have 1/4 cup of brown. You could do it the opposite where you cut back on the white, but since we're going to get a lot of caramelization from the bananas, then it can tend to be kind of over caramelized if we keep the full amount of brown sugar and reduce the white instead. And then the other substitution that we're making is for the oil. And again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you make all these substitutions in the same loaf, but I just want to show you for demonstration purposes. So before we had just oil, now we're going to have 1/2 oil and 1/2 applesauce. And this is unsweetened applesauce, so no sugar added, which is really important. So I'll go ahead and add 1/2 the amount of oil that we had before. And then it's not exactly 1/2 the amount of applesauce. What you'll want to do is it will end up being too moist if you just do 1/2 and 1/2. So cut back just slightly on the applesauce. So instead of having the amount that was there, it just took a little bit out. Just remove a teaspoon to a tablespoon so it's a little bit less in volume, and then you can use that. So I'll go ahead and use my scraper. Put that in. You can see you're getting a lot of fruit in this recipe, right? Now we have the apples, the bananas. It's really surprising how good it is for being, a much more healthy version of this. And then I'm going to keep the vanilla the same. And then go ahead and whisk up the wet ingredients just till everything's well incorporated. And then we'll check on our flax egg and add that as well. So let's see what we have here. So flax egg here, it's kind of separated, just stir it back together. A little gummy, that's okay. It does not have a very appealing texture usually in the container, but that's okay. Just do whatever you need to scoop it into the liquids, and I promise it will taste good in the final product. Here. There we go. If you're having something that's a really light color, then you might notice the flax seeds in there. Banana bread is a very dark color when you bake it, so we're not too worried that it's going to add that darker color of the flax seeds. So it's really an ideal recipe to substitute those eggs with flax seeds in. All right. Again, you can even mix it a little beyond where the ingredients are all mixed together just to help dissolve that sugar a bit. That will just help it have a nicer texture when you're done baking. All right. And then we'll add walnuts to this one. So there's optional walnuts in either recipe. And the nice thing about adding nuts to anything with sugar in it, again, that it's going to affect your blood sugar less. And anytime you can blunt the effect of carbohydrates on your blood sugar, the less your appetite's going to spike later. And if you're someone who's really working to control your blood sugar, say you have diabetes, something, or you're at risk of diabetes, then having nuts, which are rich in fat and fiber and protein, all that fat is healthy fat, is going to be, again, helpful in just balancing the effect that the dessert has on your body. So just because my bowl is bigger with the dry ingredients, I'll dump the wet into the dry, but it really doesn't matter which you dump into which. The important step is going to be mixing, and I know I mentioned this in the other banana bread recipe, but it's even going to be more important than the original to not overmix this, because we've taken out some of the richness because we've reduced the fat. We took out the eggs. So if you overmix this, you're going to end up with a flat brick. If you do it like I show you, it'll be nice, light, fluffy. It'll be very tasty. And then I'm just going to go ahead and add my nuts in at this stage too. A lot of people will add them later, but then I find you're more likely to overmix your batter, which is what you call it when it's all mixed together, the batter. So, and again, I'm just folding. I'm scooping with my rubber spatula along the bottom and kind of folding over the ingredients. I like to turn the bowl when I do it. It's easier on the shoulders. And again, you do not want to whisk. You'll also get a lot of this stuck in the whisk and it will be hard to clean. So for multiple reasons, don't whisk it at this stage. Keep checking the bottom of the bowl. A lot of dry flour likes to hide out down there. We're almost there. So again, we just want to get it to the stage where there are just a few little dry specks of flour, but otherwise it mostly looks mixed together and not mixed beyond that. Beyond that is overmixing. So now we have our prepared pan. In the other video I showed, I just sprayed with nonstick spray and lined it with parchment, which will allow us to get this out easier. This is especially helpful when you have the lower fat version of the dessert, because it's going to be more likely to stick than the regular version. So parchment is really your friend when you reduce fat in recipes. Okay. And then kind of shake it to even things out. You can tap it with a cutting board. I know people are really worried about doing that when you have that leavening in there, but it's really more important once you're baking it that you don't slam the pan down. At this point, the bubbles really haven't fully formed, so you can bang it on the counter to level it out if you need. All right, so this is ready to go in the oven. You could sprinkle more nuts on the top if you wanted to give it a nice appearance. You could put banana slices. Some people like to put some, long pieces of dried banana. You could sprinkle some cinnamon sugar if you don't really care about adding a little more sugar. Lots of ways you could dress this up. We're just going to do the plain version today, and then we'll show you what it looks like when it's finished in about an hour or so. So here we have our original banana bread recipe, and then our one with a bunch of substitutions that we made to make it a little bit better from a health profile standpoint are done. And I'm just going to pull this out of the pan just like we did before using the parchment. So you can see it also lifts right out just like the original version. And then I'm going to peel the parchment off the side. Quite hot, be careful. Maybe you use a oven mitt if this is you at home and you don't have, experienced hands of a chef where you know how long you can touch something before it burns you. So you can see, nice browning throughout, really nice texture. And so we want to let these cool at least an hour. You want it totally cool before you slice it. That will help it to finish cooking. It will reduce it being gummy or smushed looking when you cut it. It will leave the crumb, which is the appearance when you slice any sort of baked good, kind of nice and open. It will have the nicest texture to eat that way as well. So we have this on a cooling rack, elevated above the level of the counter a little bit so that air can circulate underneath to keep that nice crisp crust that we worked so hard to develop.